Hello, today I'm going to talk about the history of teaching and standards for professional development. My name is Josh Virostko, and looking at back at the history of professional development, there's been many different strides achieved. One is that standards have changed over time in the United States of America. For instance, we went from strictly a religious-based Protestant Eastern colonies from the England to moving towards local communities to states to federal standards now that currently have with No Child Left Behind and Common Core. Early on, all the reason for schooling was to make sure that our young children, mainly boys, would be able to read in order to read the scripture of the Bible. Curriculum was based strictly on the Bible studies, Latin and Greek classics, and teachers was looked at as more taskmasters, not instructors. What this means is that physical punishment was more than accepted, and that you were molding young boys to be young gentlemen in the future, and that was the role of a teacher. There was no standards or community as far as the community wanted, and that was just if they thought you were doing a good job of raising the young boys into being manhood, then you were kept on. If not, then you were let go. Massachusetts-based school law was the first law system that basically said that kids had to go to school. Again, this is only for young boys. The idea is that they were allowed to go to school in the concept that they were supposed to be taught proper morals, and then they would become good citizens in the Protestant value system. Christopher Dock of Pennsylvania opened the first school system in Pennsylvania with a formal development for teachers to follow. They had guidelines for obedience, respect, and manners. This is basically the first evaluation system in which teachers were taught how to do these things and then expected to implement the procedures that Mr. Dock had laid forth. Then our forefathers, such as Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, also made an impact on the education system in regards to professional development. Ben Franklin starts to make the first movement away from strictly Bible studies into more philosophical approach. And then Thomas Jefferson also looks at more of a tracking system in which he has a higher educational system for people of the aristocracy, and then maybe a lower education system which you were taught a trade for more the labor force. Now, these trade school teachers were strictly people in the field that were more apprentice type level than it was actual teacher to pupil that we think of today. And then they were strictly judging their professional development on whether they were good at their job. If they were a good leather maker, then they were good at teaching kids how to make leather. If they were a good blacksmith, then they would be good at teaching blacksmith. No real teacher standards or professional development in that aspect. Then in the 1700s, Noah Webster comes up with the first spelling/textbooks. It was basically a framework for teachers to use and guide them with their grammar and their approach to the English language, proper spelling, things of that nature. And then legally, the law in 1785 makes our first step towards local control of education. This is where it said that local townships of 640 acres or more had to provide a school system for their children in that area. Now, again, the whole ownership was on the local community to implement what standards they felt were important, what values, what morals, and what curriculum would be taught within their school system. And they'd find a taskmaster that could implement what they felt was important. And this was very, very wide from all across the country. From our southern roots, they were more of a farming community, to our northern urban industrial area, which would be different from state to state, town to town. Instructions were chosen still based on moral fiber, instructional ability, but the law foundation allowing local government to be the charge of the education system was the ultimate control. The Boston English School was the first high school in America in which they had more of a standard curriculum and multiple instructors that would specialize in different areas. This is when you first see students start to go from class to class, and teachers were expected to be experts in their certain area that they were teaching. You also get away from the idea of one taskmaster teaching all ages and all curriculum, and more specialized teachers that were experts in certain fields, such as maybe Greek or Latin or history, that they would teach strictly their subject area. This, again, is a step towards professional developing and specializing what you would be able to teach. The century we start to move to the first Board of Education in Massachusetts that lays out basically standards on how they're going to evaluate teachers. An evaluation system was put forth, not so much a formal one as we think of today, but more of like just standards that teachers were expected to follow. And all through the 1700s, 1800s, it was more of a moral code that teachers had to be upheld to They were supposed to be the righteous role models for the youth to become the kind of citizens that all these towns expected to have. Now in the 1900s, we start to see Progressive Education Association, which provides college standards for teachers, and you get formal training for teachers. That we had teaching colleges that started to come about. That we were like, there was this movement that teachers had to be trained and taught the way to instruct. Instruction was always thought of as like you just told the kids to do this and they did it, and if they didn't, they could get beat. Now in the 1900s, we start to see more of a philosophy of like, hey, this is how kids learn, and if you are good at teaching, you need to know these skills. B.F. Skinner, one of the forefronts of this development, instructional philosophy, based his on operative conditioning. Horace Mann was also an important person that I did not mention in the 1800s, that he actually starts to make some movement towards educational system. Then we have Bloom's taxonometry. Bloom's taxonometry is huge in the education field in the 1900s because it actually allows a measuring stick for learning and how we can move up the levels of Bloom's education system. And then teachers were taught on how to move up the levels, and if they weren't reaching the certain standards, then they were instructed in how to do so. Again, this all is based on training and professional development, and teachers had to learn how to do this. I provided a YouTube video that kind of shows a snapshot of a school system in the 1950s, which basically was the last step before a modern classroom. The National Department of Education is established, which basically allows the federal government to start to step in and make requirements. We see a lot of this in the civil rights movement, as well as kids with disabilities, as well as low-income students, that the federal government says, listen, all students deserve an opportunity to learn. Dr. Colden comes up in the 60s and 70s, this open classroom approach, where you see a collaboration basically with all the teachers in an open classroom setting, which all of them are sharing in the advancement of the kids. Again, this is a training system that had to be learned, schools had to adapt, and school districts had to make the proper approach. Piaget publishes his learning cycle, which also is a professional development element, that training for teachers on how students learn and how you can move up that level of learning. But in the 1980s is when we actually see Madeline Hunter's publishes The Master Teacher, which is basically the current professional developmental system in its infancy stage. Madeline Hunter said teachers had to learn, they had to gain towards mastery. They came in at different stages, and they moved up the ranks as they grew as a teacher. And if they refused to grow, they would not move up the ranks. Then we see certain things get established in the nation, such as Nation at Risk. Nation at Risk is published in the 1980s, which basically puts our teachers at notice that they have to be doing a better job, and the federal government said if they're not doing a better job, there was a process to remove teachers from their jobs. So professional development becomes even more key in the late 80s to early 90s. Then we move into today's. We have things such as IDEA 97, which has been big in the 2000s, in which kids with disabilities have to be taught equally. We have a lot of co-teaching settings, which has taken professional development. We've had a lot of ideas as far as you have to implement the IEP modifications, accommodations, which has taken professional development to the next level. And now currently we have No Child Left Behind and Common Core. These both have been spearheaded by the Danielson model, which is an evaluation system that most states use, including our state of Illinois, in which teachers are evaluated on are they implementing the 4 phases of professional growth. And this has really made professional development even more important than it ever has been.